115 million children are involved in hazardous work worldwide. The international community says it hopes to eliminate the problem by 2016. Is that realistic? Isn't working even in hazardous conditions the least of two evils? And do children in poor countries have other options? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. In a new report issued on the World Day Against Child Labour, the International Labour Organization warns that a high number of children are still caught in hazardous work. The report says that some 115 million children, more than half of the 215 million child labourers worldwide, do hazardous work. The report also indicates that the largest proportion of children in hazardous work relative to the overall number of children in the region is in sub-Saharan Africa, but the largest number of children in hazardous work is in Asia. In Pakistan, for instance, despite the existence of child labour laws, the fate of children has not improved. Kamal Haider reports from Islamabad.
115 million children are trapped in hazardous work worldwide. In Islamabad, young children working side by side with adults. Many of them come from large families whose only option for survival is to send their children to work. 12-year-old Baba joined the mechanics here as an apprentice so he can support his family. His ailing dad, Baba says, makes money by washing other people's clothes. And when we asked him why he doesn't go to school, his answer was simple.
I have 9 brothers and sisters. School was never an option. I had to learn a trade so I could help my brothers and sisters.
Babar is proud of the fact that he's now learned how to disassemble a motorbike engine and put it all back together. And that's not all. He has his own very young apprentice. 9-year-old Amir Khan, who says he can fix the wheel bearings but admits he has a lot to learn. And just like his mentor Babar, the pressure to support his family financially forced him to look for a job.
So far the child labor is concerned, it is normally said that children are emotionally priceless, while economically the children are worthless because they don't contribute so much in the household economy.
From these young boys selling tarpaulins by the roadside or rummaging through other people's garbage to find something of value, the alarm bells were already ringing of an economy teetering on the brink of collapse. And these children, considered the future of any proud nation, who should otherwise have been in school, now help their elders cope collectively, trying to alleviate their misery. Kamal Haider for Inside Story, Islamabad.
Well, joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests from Geneva, Susan Gunn, author of the ILO report on child labour in hazardous work. From London, Marco Manacorda, Professor of Economics at Queen Mary University of London and a Research Associate at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. And also joining us from New Delhi, Vandana Shiva, ecologist and anti-poverty activist. Welcome all to the show. Thank you very much for being on Inside Story today. Susan Gunn, if I may start with you. Now, you're the author of this report on hazardous child labour. Tell us exactly what determines hazardous child labour. What are the specific hazards for children and in what sectors?
Well, we have been seeing a decline overall in child labor levels, but just in the last 4 years, there has been an abrupt increase in the levels of hazardous child labor, particularly among older youth. Now, what is the cause of that? We think in part during the last 10 years of intense work, we've been focusing on girls, and we've been focusing on getting the younger children into school. Now, that is bearing fruit. We can see the results. We can see the numbers coming down. But the older children, the teenagers, the adolescents, those are the ones who seem to be falling between the cracks. And I think that an intensive campaign, such as we have been conducting with girls over the last few years, will bring the same kind of rewards in terms of falling numbers.
Are these children deliberately put in danger by the people who want them to work?
No, I think almost all employers and all parents want the best for their children. The big problem is a lack of awareness. People don't realize particularly the special vulnerabilities that children have. And they think that when they're working alongside their families, they're working on the farm, that basically this is safe work. But they don't realize often that the pesticides are extremely toxic. They don't realize, for example, the families that are working in mining, where they have to mix the mercury that extracts the gold from the surrounding stone. They don't realize that that's going to have an effect upon the intelligence of their children. So these are invisible hazards that are going to, that if people can become aware of what the dangers are, I am sure that they will try to provide an alternative or find another alternative. So the main alternative, of course, is school.
Right. So, of course, there's a huge lack of awareness, you say. We'll talk about the alternatives in just a few minutes. Let me bring in Vandana Shiva now in New Delhi. You have first-hand experience in India, of course. Paint us a picture of the situation there. Is it improving at all?
Well, the causes of child labor are the displacement of the parents from livelihoods. I think that needs to be recognized clearly, that in a globalized economy where labor has been deregulated, employers will seek the cheapest labor possible, and there's so many analyses that the globalized economy is based on slave labor. One of the elements of slave labor is children's labor, while their parents who had productive work on farms, in fisheries, in forests, are losing that employment, either because of a direct attack on livelihoods or because of the destruction and appropriation of the natural resource base that makes local economies work.
All right.
If I've just come from the Himalayan villages, there's no child labor there. These are economies that are in balance. It's when economies go out of balance and only work for the profit motive for a globalized market at any cost, exploitation of nature and exploitation of children increases.
All right, Marco Manacorda in London, do you agree with that? Can we blame globalization for the high levels of child labor today?
Well, I've heard two sort of stories. One was a lack of awareness as being at the root of child labor. The other one is globalization. I would be much more cautious, and I'm happy to talk about the evidence on the effect of globalization on child labor. Let me preempt that as an economist, you might think that child labor is determined by supply, in other terms, dire poverty of the parents, and potentially demand, which can be in part the result of globalization. In brief, the evidence that we have is that globalization, in particular trade openness, doesn't seem to lead to an increase in child labor. These are just a limited number of studies that we have. And in part because it increases living standards, it might increase inequality, but doesn't necessarily increase poverty. Actually, we have the opposite result. And so that's in terms of labor supply. There's no push there. And in terms of the demand for child labor, yes, it might well be that there are expansions of industries which employ children, but most of the children who work in the world are not employed in manufacturing or in cheap expert manufacturing. So on balance, we don't have strong evidence that trade openness, which is one dimension of globalization, is associated to a rise in child labor.
All right, Vandana Shiva, let me just ask you once again about the Indian example. Tell us more about the situation in India itself. Would you say that this is more prevalent among poorer levels of the Indian society, or are the most educated segments of Indian society also affected by this phenomenon?
No, the educated elements of Indian society are not affected. If they are affected by a disease, it's consumerism for their children. What is really happening through globalization, trade liberalization, is, for example, a shrimp industry comes up along the coastal areas. It's a toxic industry. It destroys local fisheries. It destroys local farms. Parents who were making a living are thrown out into unemployment, and then the fisheries industry, the shrimp industry, hires the children to harvest fingerlings of the shrimp in the mangroves. I have seen this with my own eyes. I think we need to recognize that the rise of child labor is linked with the destruction of adult livelihoods. And no parent, as was said earlier by the first speaker, no parent would throw their child into earning a living for the family if the parents could earn that living adequately themselves. And unfortunately, it is not true that trade liberalization has strengthened workers' rights and labor standards. It has dismantled and deregulated the labor market, which is why we see increased exploitation of children in the labor market.
Well, according to the ILO, 173 countries have committed themselves to tackling hazardous work of children as a matter of urgency by ratifying the ILO's worst forms of child labor. That's Convention number 182. Now, this convention was unanimously adopted at the ILO's International Labour Conference in June of 1999 in Geneva. The convention defines the worst forms of child labor as all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, the use, procuring or offering of a child for prostitution, the use, procuring or offering of a child for illicit activities, in particular for the production and trafficking of drugs, and work which by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out is likely to harm health, safety or morals of children. Susan Gunn, just tell us more about this convention. And are there any success stories among the 173 countries that have ratified it? Where has there been progress in addressing this issue of hazardous child labor?
We know some people say, well, you pass a law and nothing happens. But in actual fact, you've got to have that law, that framework, that legal framework for labor inspectors, for employers, for everyone to know what is the right thing to do, if you will. Now, the fact that Convention 182 has been so widely ratified means that the international community has really become gradually aware of the plight of children in hazardous work. And I just want to remind us that of the list of occupations, of the types of work that you mentioned, the largest is hazardous work. Between 90 and 95% of children who are in the worst forms of child labor are in hazardous work. Now, hazardous work is something virtually everybody can agree is not a good thing for children to be involved in. I mean, we all agree that it's useful for children to learn skills, to help their families, and to do things like that. But hazardous work, working down in mines, working for, let's say, 12 hours a day behind a carpet loom, working in a brick kiln, working in deep-sea fishing, things like this, it's unequivocally bad. Now, I would just point out that the important thing about Convention 182 is that it requires countries to make a list of hazardous child labor.
Sure.
And when they do that, they have to involve members of the private sector, the companies, the employers. They also have to involve the trade unions, and they also provide an opportunity for youth and children to have a voice.
And Susan,
and you make a list of what is...
Yes, sorry to interrupt you, but interestingly, in your report, we were just talking about the Indian example there for a moment ago with Vandana, but interestingly, in your report, this situation is not just prevalent in developing nations, and I want you to tell us more about the situation in developed countries, because they're also affected by this issue of hazardous child labor.
You know, hazardous child labor is found everywhere in the world. And in the industrial nations, for example, you have children in agriculture. That's probably where the greatest number of deaths occur. And that's because of agricultural machinery.
In which countries,
in the developing world, well, you find it, we have good statistics from Europe, we have good statistics from the United States, from North America, from South America. They all show consistently the same results. You have almost twice the number of injuries on the part of children as opposed to adults. And agriculture takes different forms. In agriculture in the developing countries, the greatest risk is the pesticides, because people, as they begin to use them, they're not aware of the toxic effects, and they become poisoned. So in the industrial countries, you find fast food, you find, the new sort of occupations that are developing. You have children working in shops, sometimes after hours and subject to violence. So there's hazardous child labor everywhere in the world.
Okay.
But there are some very good examples of addressing it.
Okay, Marco Manacorda in London, if you could just tell us whether the global economic crisis in the last few years has had an impact on this high level of child workers that we're seeing around the world. How much impact has it had? Do you think that the break in progress in eliminating child labor is perhaps due to the global economic crisis that we've experienced in the last few years, not just in developing nations, of course, but also in the developed world?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the economic crisis has taken its toll on children and working children. As far as I know, we don't have hard evidence that I've seen so far about the effect of the economic crisis, but I think we can learn quite a lot from previous economic crises. And that's actually an interesting sort of twist there, because we know that in general, at better times, children are more likely to work, which might seem a paradox. And the reason is that, on the one hand, yes, parents are better off, but on the other hand, employment opportunities for children actually improve. That might sort of make you predict that during a crisis, children actually are less likely to work, which is not the case. And in particular, what happens for example, we have evidence from Argentina, the big financial crisis at the beginning of the decade, last decade, where there was a big rise in child labor just after the crisis. I think we have some evidence for Indonesia. Possibly schooling is sometimes more elastic than child labor. In other terms, perhaps children first withdraw from school and then some enter into work. And the reason is quite obvious, is because schooling might have direct costs in addition to the opportunity costs of
okay. Well, let's take a look at some of the
children to work.
Okay, Marco. Let's take a look at some of the recommendations and suggested solutions that the ILO is making to deal with this issue. The report stresses that major and sustainable progress requires public policies that address the root causes of child labor, tackling poverty, ensuring children have access to education, as Marco just mentioned there, and providing a social protection floor to protect the vulnerable. Now, overall, the report makes the case for children in hazardous work being made a priority for action over the next 5 years. It calls for specific action on 3 fronts. 1, making a renewed effort to ensure that all children are in school at least until the minimum age of employment. 2, strengthening workplace safety and health for all workers, but with specific safeguards for youth between the minimum age of employment and the age of 18. And lastly, also providing the crucial legal foundation for action against hazardous child work with the support of workers and employers. Well, if I may ask you, Vandana Shiva in New Delhi, are these recommendations realistic to you? Can they be implemented in India, for instance?
Well, child labor is created in a context. And as I said, it's created in a context where deliberate unemployment is created for adults. And what we need to do, the real recommendation that's needed, is the right to dignified and fully paid work for every adult in society. That means designing an economy that has place for everyone, rather than an economy that uproots people and displaces people, which is the kind of wars we are seeing in India right now. And children get caught within that displacement. I feel recommendations are vital, but the fabric of society, the fabric of economy is where the problem is created and where the problem must be solved.
All right. Susan Gunn in London, some would argue that, yes, it's realistic, the point made in point 3 there, it's realistic to use action and perhaps sanctions to enforce rights to free expression, for instance, but less effective when it comes to social issues. It's basically impossible, some would say, to force an impoverished country to maintain Western standards of education and labor laws, which didn't even exist when the West wasn't developed. What would you say to this?
First of all, the International Labour Organization is composed, you know, of countries all over the world. These are the ones who set the international standards. So there's 183 countries that are members of the ILO, and it was they who accepted these standards. And I would agree very strongly that it's decent work for adults that is going to make the difference. But that also takes a long time, and when we're talking about hazardous child labor, we're talking about an extremely urgent situation. I mean, there's children's lives who are being lost at this moment while we're talking during the period of this interview. And so it is crucial that we sort of take a two-pronged approach, that we do some immediate actions that are going to make a difference. And some of the best examples are coming now from the South, from India, from Brazil, from Chile, from Lebanon, from Egypt. You have a lot of very, very good examples that have of countries that have taken whole areas and made them child labor free. It can be done, but at the same time, you've got to provide the underlying social protection floor that enables adults to have good jobs and keep their families properly provided for.
Mm. Marco, in London, do you think it's realistic, the target of eliminating the worst forms of child labour by 2016? Is it realistic, in your opinion, when you take into account the economic crisis? Some would say this is almost unachievable.
It's hard to know. Certainly, you know, one big effect of the economic crisis is that international aid has actually shrank, and there's, you know, public expenditure shrank. So any effort that requires a policy intervention is going to be hampered by the economic crisis per se. And in reality, you know, going back to the discussion that we just had, is the problem is that the kind of dilemma that we have, we cannot prevent child labor per se, because we might fear that that's going to come to the cost of children or their households. And so that's why there's a need for social protection that has to go together with that. In other terms, compensating potentially these households for the lack of resources that come from the children not working anymore. And obviously that requires public expenditure, which is considerable.
What about the pressure? What about pressure and boycotts? So can that be effective on exports, for instance? I mean, what about pressure on consumers? People have always said that they're willing to pay for more ethical products. Can consumer power be effective?
Well, there is some discussion in the literature, again, on these, and I know there's a lot of activists that think it's a way to go. Again, we must wonder whether this is not going to come to the detriment of the same children that we want to eventually sort of help. There's no evidence that I know of that is, you know, scientific to the standards that I would consider such, where there's any, you know, correlation between these boycotts and reduction in child labor, because I think this is a complicated issue.
All right. Vandana Shiva, if I may ask you, how costly would it be for a country such as India to crack down on child labor?
I think if you don't allow the destruction of people's rights to their resources and livelihoods, there's actually no cost involved in respecting the rights of people, respecting the rights of the tribals who, when they're displaced, will have to send their children into all kinds of hazardous industries.
Some would say there needs to be alternatives to previous employment, and that's not highly achievable because of political impediments, for instance.
That's the whole issue, that we are growing in an economy with very high growth rates, with fewer and fewer opportunities for fewer and fewer people, and higher concentration in the hands of a few billionaires who now control 1/3 of India's economy, largely through a resource grab and a land grab. That means unemployment, and that means the families that must survive must somehow survive in hazardous ways, in the worst kinds of occupations. As far as the issue of schooling as an alternative is concerned, if you allow the privatization of education, if you destroy the public commitment of government to offer education, that becomes an empty promise. And that's why we have to look at it in holistic terms.
Okay.
In terms of the rush to corporatize and privatize every aspect of life.
Okay, thank you very much. Vandana Shiva, you had the last word. Thank you all for taking part in this edition of Inside Story. In Geneva, Susan Gunn; in London, Marco Manacorda; and in New Delhi, Vandana Shiva. And thank you as well for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at our usual address, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.